story of immigrants, refugees coming to this country and starting a business with knowledge that they had at home and really bringing something to America. In one level, just jobs and money, but also this kind of cultural phenomenon that has introduced this really American ingredient. MSG, who knew it was really kelp, needs a new name. Yeah, MSG, monosodium glutamate, maybe it does just need a rebrand because that's the chemical term for it. And I think maybe that is part of what people find intimidating. But to be fair, it does already come under many names. So in Whole Foods, one of my friends showed me a bottle of what was called kelp extract, and kelp extract was just MSG. If you're a fan of Vegemite or Marmite, that is also just MSG. In any ingredients list, it can also be listed as yeast extract. Yeast extract is MSG. So it already comes under many, many different names, and we're consuming it as both an additive and just a natural part of many of our regular foods, everything from beef to Parmesan cheese. So it is all around us and in our bodies, as you now know. The whole thing about MSG. I know, that's why I wanted to write that chapter, because as I mentioned in the book, I come from a family of artists, historians, and chemists. So I grew up in this environment with my dad and my brother. My brother has his doctorate from MIT in organic chemistry. And so it just really taught me to approach food both with the scholarship of a historian, the emotions of a human being, attaching our histories to those recipes, but also to come at it as a skeptic and really look at, something like MSG. There's two sides to that story, right? That on one side, it's just a lack of, I want to say, understanding. I think sometimes that the people who discover amazing things, the scientists, aren't always the best educators too, and it takes journalists in the middle to be able to take that information and translate it for a broader audience. But then, of course, the side effects of that were that an entire generation of Chinese immigrants, and still to this day, experienced this xenophobia based on this 19th century idea too of you add cats and rats to your food, and then in the 20th century became you add MSG. So it had these much older sort of cultural fear connotations too. Surprised to hear that curry was an old thing too. Yeah, that's the one. When I was working on this project, everyone would always say, okay, well, what are the flavors? And I'd go through the list, and then when I got to curry, everyone would say, wait, stop, that's not an American flavor. And I thought that in itself was really important, that sometimes we're very choosy in what we accept into American culture and what we do not. That we've been making curries in America since the 18th century and have been hosting immigrants from the Middle East and East Asia since the late 19th century, but yet even after over 200 years, we don't consider curry an American dish. I think that that's kind of really important to note. Catherine says, I was fascinated by the colonial history of pepper outside of Boston. I wonder if you considered cinnamon or ginger, as we referenced pumpkin spice at the end. And I see your question too, Margaret. We'll get to that. So I did think about doing cinnamon, but when I started doing my research, I discovered that our sort of love of cinnamon and the availability of it as a spice was already well established before the first English immigrants / colonists came to America. So in order to just be able to find a definition and a focus for my book, I just wanted to look at America of the last 200 years, but I've considered doing like an additional chapter or something. Maybe I'll come back to it on cinnamon, because certainly America loves cinnamon in much of the same ways in the other chapters. Like, our love of it outweighs the consumption in almost every other country. We intensely love not only cinnamon, but its cousin cassia, which is sort of in the same family of trees, but has an even more intense flavor. And we do, despite the fact our cuisine has stereotypes of being bland, Americans do tend to like the more both pure and intense versions of flavors. So I did think about cinnamon. And ginger, interestingly enough, as I talked about in the introduction, as I kind of plotted things on the graph, like ginger kind of usage didn't even come close to the other 8 that I ended up considering in the book. It seems to be more an ingredient that historically we used in blends with other spices. So it appears in a curry blend, it appears in a pumpkin spice blend. And now, of course, that is changing since the 1960s, as we're seeing more immigrants coming from Asia and East Asia too. So maybe in the expansion. So question of why does it cause headaches, sometimes referring to MSG. It doesn't, as far as anybody can tell. There have been a lot of studies that have proven there are no harmful side effects of MSG. But what is happening is that it's often in foods that have other irritants and allergens. So, one of the most common causes of the headache associated with MSG comes from consuming too much sodium, because MSG is monosodium glutamate, but it's harder to detect the sodium when it's in MSG than when it's in table salt. And it's the same sodium, but one tastes saltier and one tastes more savory. So especially if those two ingredients are being used together in the same dish, you can have a lot of salt. There's also many other allergens in for someone who maybe comes from Western heritage in Chinese food. Things like shellfish, things like soy, other things that can trigger a headache too. So what has been discovered is that it's not really the MSG itself that is causing an adverse reaction. It has sort of been blamed for a panoply of reasons that you might not feel well or have a headache or that you might be allergic to something else in the same dish. It's just been given this label of Chinese restaurant syndrome, which is also a really terrible name for a reaction that also doesn't exist. So there's been lots and lots of studies, and I do go over that in the MSG chapter too, about both why we got this fear and this idea that it was bad for our health and we had reactions, and then how that's been disproven again and again and again and again. But again, I just think the information hasn't been getting out there in a good way.
Sarah, do you think that if MSG had been called something else, it might not have been given such a bad rap? I mean, MSG is a pretty name. And where did it just come from, the whole chemical compound, or
Yeah, like we
it's
don't
not a
call
very creative name?
table salt is, sodium chloride as opposed,
Mm-hmm.
but we do have this other name, table salt, to it too. That's hard for me to say. I mean, yes, we don't call sugar by its chemical name, but we do call aspartame, by its chemical name.
Is
So
that real? Yeah.
I think that it's a little bit more, I think we just need better education in general. And I think that we need to not, I also in that chapter sort of outline how we got to a point where we're afraid of science. And again, I think that part of that is maybe a lack of good communication between people who are in different scientific fields and the general public. But I believe that we shouldn't find the chemical name of something scary, because table salt, if I call it sodium chloride, it's not any worse for me. So I would love it to be less about, like, in a way, advertising, right? And just like the name of something, and more about just the factual information. But also, to be fair, sodium chloride can be bad for us.
Yeah.
We can consume too much of it. Sugar can be bad for us. Ethanol, which is just alcohol that we drink, is literally a poison. That's why we drink it. It's a fun poison. And obviously, if you drink too much ethanol, it can be a deadly poison too. So there are many, many foods that we consume every day that if we consume in excess, we have adverse reactions to. So something like monosodium glutamate just needs to go into that same category, where we shouldn't be using it any more than we add salt or sugar into our diet. So I guess we could open it up to just questions in general. Does anyone have any questions, curiosities about me or the book? Oh, which I just noticed is right over here on my shoulder too. I put it up there because it's my first book, and it was just such a big project that whenever I'm feeling down, I need to remind myself that I wrote a book and it exists, and there it is.
Well, I found the chapter on Sriracha to be very interesting. Well, I thought they were all interesting, but it seemed like the culmination of the true American dream. And so I was thinking, where do you think the next real success story like Sriracha is going to come from? I mean, I know you've mentioned a couple, like your ninth flavors, but what
Yeah.
part of the world do you think it's going to be from?
It's also really hard to say because, as we were talking about a little bit, we have such a terrible attitude towards immigration right now as a country. Both what I think is a very loud minority, but also, within our government, we have really actively anti immigrant policies and policies that are really delivering a message of sort of racism and xenophobia. We are keeping people out of this country. So will we even have a chance to have a ninth flavor like that? That becomes really hard to say, because not only do we have a Muslim ban in effect, but that ban also effectively ends immigration from countries and individuals that we made promises to. That in the 20 years of engagement we had in countries of the Middle East, military engagement, there were people there that helped us, and in part helped us and helped our military because we said we will allow your family to immigrate. And only but that was important to those individuals and their families' survival to be able to leave their country. And we're not making good on those promises right now. Which I think is a really dishonest thing to do and means that people are not going to be working with us in the future, too. So I would say someplace like Iran or Iraq or Afghanistan, or I might say someplace like in Central America, like El Salvador or Honduras. But right now, we're not allowing those immigrants to come in. We're stagnating as a culture. So it's really hard to say because we gave David Tran and his family an opportunity. We were in Vietnam. We gave an opportunity for a family like his, who they were ethnic minorities that were being persecuted, to come to this country as refugees and be able to apply for asylum and seek safety. And we're not letting people do that right now. So we are stopping the David Trans from coming here. So that is really disheartening to me on one level and just purely upsetting on another, that instead of letting bright entrepreneurs into this country, we are keeping them out based on their religion or the color of their skin.
So we have a good question about, or a good comment about chili. You see that from Allison there?
Yes. Oh, yes. And I see that Karen said something too, that you found compelling the chapter what the Alamo was, the story of the Mexican lady selling their wares. Oh, thank you. You captured the personalities and made it come to life. Thank you so much. I mean, when you start writing, I start to care really deeply about these people that even are historical figures. And I try to not tell a simple story. I try to really bring out how complicated humans are. That on one side, these women were growing up in a very a Catholic environment that often isolated women, that they were growing up in a country that used to be theirs and now is America, and they weren't being treated as well. But you can also really relate to like being a 16-year-old and getting these moments to like be in the spotlight and be these salespeople and interacting in this fun way. Like you can also tap in to the energy and the joy and the freedom that these women had in the same situation too. Allison also says, love the chili chapter. Thank you. Those chili queens were such strong women. Seriously. Can you talk about them? Touches both on immigration issues and towards entrepreneurial women. Yeah, certainly. So again, coming back to immigration issues, one of the things that I think is a problematic attitude that we often see displayed in America today is this idea of like, if you're going to live in this country, you need to speak English. And we can talk about that all the way back to the foundations of this country, in that it was brought up, should we make English an official language? But 35% of the residents of America at that time were German speakers. So the German speakers had an issue with English being the official language of the country that they had also helped build. So they decided, nope, America is not going to have an official language. So that to me is one of the things that's really exciting about America, that we are this really diverse nation where we have many different languages spoken. So, and that's, of course, also to tell Spanish speakers to speak English here is really backwards, considering that about a third of our country belonged to Spain and Mexico. So the people like the women like the chili queens, they didn't immigrate here. We took over their land. They didn't go anywhere. So they were also maintaining their traditions in the Southwest, and also the traditions they were maintaining became this drawing point. It appealed to tourists. So it's what brought both tourists and settlers into that part of Texas as well. And it is this really cool moment. And you might notice that it's one of the few chapters where it was hard to put a name to these individual women. I was able to sort of pull one name, Sadie, but she was actually a white woman, and she was one of the few women that was called by name. And I think I mentioned a few other names of the Spanish-speaking women, the Mexican-American women, but we don't know many details of their life because they were women and they were women of color, so their histories weren't recorded the same way that we record the histories of white men. And that was part of the motivation of this entire book, that to me it's really easy to see how diverse our country has always been when you sit down and look at our dinner table. And it's through food that we can access the stories of men and women of color that have built this country just as much as any white American has too. So I know these are like big ideas, but you read the book. Now you're getting the behind the scenes a little bit. Just to reiterate, what is so interesting is the historical background of something so simple as a spice. And that's something that, this book was inspired by the fact that I had worked with recipes in my 1848 life. And I knew that when I baked a cake in 1848, there was not a drop of vanilla in it. But then when I looked at cookbooks 50 years later at the turn of the 20th century, it was using vanilla as much as we had today. And I looked at that and said something happened. And it just took a quick Google search to begin to unveil the story of the pollination of vanilla and how it was made popular through the hands and the minds of enslaved black men, both in Seychelles, Madagascar, and now I can't think of it, Ile de Bourbon, and here in America. So I really, I really love, I knew that there was something to that. And it also just opened my eyes to the fact that I'd worked with vanilla and vanilla beans my entire adult life and had never once thought about what is a vanilla plant? What is a vanilla bean and where does that come from? So even that botanical analysis was really fascinating to me. Seeing that pepper vine the first time in the Brooklyn Botanical Garden, it was, to me, it's mind blowing and exciting because we don't often think about what these spices are like when they're at home. I'm going to skip ahead for just a moment too, because Virginia, I see rosewater is used before Avella. Was that homemade? It could be, and that's why. So in Europe, both orange water and orange flower water were used, but in America, it was much easier for us to grow damask rose, which is what rose water is made out of, than it was for us to grow. I can't actually remember what variety of orange flower water is made from. You'll have to forgive me. It might come to me later. So we didn't have as many sort of tropical climates. Like in Europe, it could be grown all around the Mediterranean and imported from the Middle East, from Persia as well. America didn't have that kind of access, so it could be homemade, but you could also purchase it from people who were making it, and it was being imported from Europe. Most of the rose water currently is made from damask rose petals that are collected in like Eastern Europe. That's where a lot of it is made now. But yeah, that's why it became more popular than vanilla or orange flower water, because it was the lowest cost because it could be locally produced in the however many states we were at any given time. So, Karen, how did you come to the device you used? Because it did seem like your grand plan was not only to describe the historical background, but to laser focus on one person and that person's contribution to the use of the spice or introduction to the culture. It's definitely something that evolved over time. That concept actually wasn't in my initial book proposal. It was telling the stories of the spices, not necessarily about the people. And it is something that came with the sort of, as I began turning in my chapters with my editor, where I would talk about someone and she would circle this and say, more about this person. This is making it humanizing. This is making it connect. And although when I was selecting the flavors and things were sort of falling into place chronologically, and I was selecting them based on my knowledge of immigration patterns in the United States, I didn't go into it thinking about, oh, I'm going to focus on this one person. But then the more research I did, it became really obvious that for the most part, each one of these sort of flavor revolutions was hinged around one person. I think the only case where that's not entirely true is the Chili Queens. And also when I talked about garlic too, it was difficult to pick out any one person that out of Italian immigration that said they made garlic popular. It's more something that happened because we went and fought two wars in France and started eating cuisine from the south of France. And then the garlic was already here because of the Italian population. But it was really, really fun to dig into the history of these key players because they're often not people that have gotten enough play in our history books, although they were obviously very influential Americans, often beyond the trajectory of food, too.
Why don't we see if anyone has been, after reading the book, if anyone's cooking has been inspired by one or, I mean, obviously we all cook with vanilla, we bake with vanilla, but some of the more unusual flavors, or if anyone has actually tried one of your recipes, which I have to admit I have not, but I might.
I would love to know if you made one of the recipes, and I'd love to know if there is an ingredient that you've now started using more thoughtfully, or that you've been a little bit more open to trying and want to try or have tried recently. Let me know.
So, Sarah, I have a bottle of Sriracha in my refrigerator, which I love Sriracha, but I looked at the expiration date on it the other day, and it's a little bit old. And I think it just kept getting spicier and spicier sitting in my refrigerator. Do
That
you
could
think
be
so?
because what might be happening is the water is evaporating, so it's just leaving but the pepper behind.
Yes.
In a way, I'm sort of surprised because, yeah, I mean, sriracha has a really long shelf life. You don't even have to put it in your refrigerator. You can leave it, it's shelf
Oh,
stable.
really?
Leave it out on your shelf, yeah. And it's supposed to be good for a couple years because it's got sugar in it, it's got acid in it in the form of vinegar, and then it's got the capsaicin from the crushed peppers, which is a really good antimicrobial. But the capsaicin degrades over time, so my guess is that it's water evaporation that's made it spicier and spicier. And
Yeah,
also, you mentioned in the book, one of my favorite facts I learned is that every bottle of sriracha is different, that
that
they
was
different
very
parts of the
interesting.
season, and that's why it's different colors. It's still sort of like a handmade product, too.
Yeah. And what was I going to? Oh, when you mentioned my antimicrobial, quite a few of the flavors have health benefits.
Yeah,
Um, and
yeah.
that was interesting, especially now where we're all trying to be as healthy as we can
Mhm.
and cooking at home. And I don't know in what quantities you need to consume some of these
Yeah,
things.
I mean, agreed. And I really wanted to get into that information too because sometimes accurate information can be hard to find, right? As I mentioned the garlic chapter, you Google garlic and it's, basically a cure-all. People says it does everything. So instead of, I wanted to look for data that was backed by science, essentially. There are a lot of maybes out there. Maybe it does this traditional uses. And a lot of them are under tested, to be honest. I think that there's a lot more research that can be done, but that has a lot to do with funding. If garlic really is a cure all, that won't make pharmaceutical companies any money. So it's always sort of difficult to get funding to do studies on something like that. Um, but I tracked down a lot of studies for each one of those, and I just found the results really fascinating in terms of what they are affecting. But yeah, you can, clean your kitchen counters with peppers and garlic and curry powder. I don't know if you'd want to, but they are really effective antimicrobials with something like garlic or chili peppers killing 99.9% of bacteria and viruses it comes in contact with. So just as good as any household cleaner.
Yeah, I thought that was very interesting. And so no one's put in if they've made any of the recipes or been inspired by the recipes. So well, let's move on to another question for the group. Well, I guess which flavor story did you find to be the most engaging or interesting? I thought they were all pretty interesting. I really loved the story of the vanilla on two continents. That was interesting in Central America and in Madagascar. And also, garlic, I guess, wasn't quite as, I felt like I knew more about garlic. I feel like I cook with garlic every day, so it wasn't quite as exciting. Um,
I feel like the research I did let me cook with garlic better. Like I think about it. One of my colleagues recently told me that every time he smashes up garlic really fine to like get those chemicals going, he thinks of me. He thinks of me every time he cuts garlic now, and I think
oh,
that's really sweet. I two quick questions. One is that what about cloves for cleaning? Cloves smell good. They don't have as many antimicrobial properties. Those sort of like Christmassy spices, as you might think of them, they range in the 30 to 40% of antimicrobial properties. So but maybe put a little in there so that the garlic smells a little bit better. And I just saw that Karen listened to the book. Karen, I read the book. I never done something like that before. It was a really cool experience. I had to audition just like any other voice actor. And I also had a terrible cold while I was reading the book. But I don't think that if you didn't know me personally, you can tell I have a really terrible cold. But the poor audio engineer, because every 5 minutes he had to mute it so I could like off to the corner. I felt bad for him. It was a little bit of a struggle, but I'm still really, really glad that I did it. I love an audiobook personally. Oh, the soy sauce history and creation. Yeah, that's one that really surprised me in terms of how old something was to find out that we had been brewing soy sauce in America in the 18th century. That was really shocking. And also to realize that it has a link to things like Worcestershire sauce, and ketchup too. So that its legacy kind of spread out into all these different sauces. And then it came back around, 200 years and appeared back in America. Oh, and the macrocom was the history of pepper. I know. These were stories that like delighted me too. Learning about that pepper, something that's so everyday now, created America's first millionaires, and was also a way that we were like creating our own independence, right? Our financial independence and our food independence. It was very symbolic, I think, for America as well. And so Catherine was saying I was amazed that I'm baking vanilla's various forms for use for specific recipes and temperatures. Totally, and I stand by that. I'm vanilla obsessed in a way. I'm so fascinated by the plant and the flavor of it. I have like a vanilla collection. I buy it as souvenirs. I was in Hawaii about a year ago, and on Kauai specifically, and visited a place that grew vanilla and bought like a Kauai vanilla extract. I have and I stand by my vanilla recommendations when to use them. One of my favorite tools is called baking vanilla. I'm trying to think of the maker now that I have, but it's 50% natural vanilla and 50% artificial vanilla. And I think it's the best for cookies in particular, but also great in cakes. It just really gives you the full range and fullness of vanilla flavor. I think it's really, really lovely. And when I make ice cream, I tend to double up. I use a vanilla bean in the custard, but I'll also will maybe stir in. I really love Penzeys. They used to call it double fold, which is actually the industry term, but now I think they just call it double strength vanilla. But two-fold vanilla means it has twice as many vanilla beans when they infused it, and then four-fold is 4 times as many, and they even make it up to like 20-fold, but that's only available commercially. But with Penzeys, you can get a double strength vanilla that is really, really tasty. But as you probably noticed, vanilla is really, really, really expensive right now. So maybe you want to switch to rose water.
Well,
Very
that's why I thought it was interesting that you said for things like cookies to use artificial vanilla is the way to go. I haven't bought that in years, but
Yeah, and I
it's
think it's important.
significantly less expensive.
We have this sort of prejudice against chemicals, but the main flavor and aroma component of a vanilla bean is a chemical called vanillin. It's a compound. And that same compound is what is in artificial vanilla. They synthesize it from a different source, but it is indistinguishable. It is the same compound. Of course, like the negative parts about artificial vanilla is that it can be very like flat, one note flavor. It can also be very bitter. Vanillin is very bitter on its own. And vanilla beans are very bitter. We're used to adding it to sweet things, but if you just like bite a vanilla bean, it doesn't actually taste very good. It smells really good. But that bitterness can come through sometimes in your baking products. But, vanilla beans, which have over 200 different flavor and aroma compounds, they burn off at high heat. And so it's better to have that more pungent dose of that single most important chemical, vanillin. So that's why I think a blend is really awesome. And it also, again, saves you a lot of money. America's Test Kitchen did a study
Yes.
on it a couple years ago. Yeah, even before the vanilla prices shot up recently. So now your savings are even more significant. So it's definitely worth just having it in your kitchen and putting it in when you're going, even if you do it with real vanilla, when something's going into high heat, it'll just give you a better, stronger flavor.
It's interesting because I saw that on America's Test Kitchen. I don't know, they replayed it a couple of months ago, and I was like trying to take pictures of the of the TV to see that which brands they were recommending, and they really had strong opinions about some of them.
Yeah.
And I don't think they're ones that you can get in Stop and Shop necessarily, but some
Yeah.
of them were. I mean, McCormick or whatever.
Yeah,
Make
yeah, McCormick and is it Winton? It's a major brand, but the one that's the baking vanilla that I like, I actually got on Amazon too. And then Penzeys, I have a Penzeys store actually in my neighborhood. I do think there's one. There must be one in Connecticut.
There's one in Norwalk right near us.
I love Penzeys. I think the quality of their spices is really great, and their price point is really great too. Um, question is, do you have a favorite celebrity chef that one you find uses spices and educates well? Yes, it's someone that I interviewed in my book, Chef Floyd Cardoz, who I also want to mention his name too because he passed away a few months ago as a result of COVID 19.
Hmm.
And so that was really heartbreaking because even though I only knew him on a professional basis, whenever I reached out to him, I always found him to be exceptionally generous with his time. And just a really thoughtful advocate for Indian cuisine and Indian people in the United States. And so he won one season of Top Chef Master Chef. Is that what it's called? The Top Chef like celebrity version that had like well-known chefs competing in it. So he won there. He's also written a couple amazing cookbooks. And he is just such a beautiful educator. So anything you can find about him, including that season of Top Chef, I highly recommend it. He was just a wonderful man who cooked really amazing food, and especially when you're talking about spices and ingredients, like a lot of those ingredients, as you probably noticed, come from that part of the world. They're coming from the tropics, they're coming from Indonesia, they're coming from India. So those parts of the world have had a couple thousand years of a leg up on Europeans in terms of using those ingredients within their cuisine. So I always find the perspectives from that world really fascinating and influential. I will put it in the chat. How about that? Floyd Cardoz, and I
Good
interviewed
idea.
him in the curry chapter of the book too.
Oh, good. You traveled a lot in writing this book. What was your favorite destination?
This book brought me to California for the first time.
Hmm.
So I was in California for about 2 weeks, and I started in LA and started with the Sriracha factory, and then also got to visit the farm where the peppers were grown, and that was just a really awesome experience too. And then I got to sort of travel north up the coast and just hit a lot of different places. Ending up in San Francisco doing sort of research about soy sauce and San Francisco's Chinatown there. So I really enjoyed being able to see that part of the country and have been back many times since. But the amount of travel I did in that book won't hold a candle to the amount of travel I did in 2019 to research my current project. My current project is, at least for the moment, titled Endangered Eating, Exploring America's Vanishing Food. And I'm looking at 8 different ingredients essentially from around America that are on the verge of extinction. So it brought me to that many regions and then some. In 2019, I went to Southern California, Hawaii, the Navajo Nation in New Mexico and Arizona, the Pacific Northwest, Upper Minnesota and the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, New York and New Jersey, which is not so far afield. So it was nice to come home in some ways. South Carolina and Louisiana. And I was supposed to actually go to Oklahoma to do one more research trip, but that got canceled in March. And we'll see what happens. I was supposed to go out to the Choctaw Nation to cook with a food scholar out there. So I'm bummed to miss that, but it also just doesn't, even though we can do it outdoors, we're supposed to cook outdoors, doesn't seem worth the risk to either he or I or our families. So I'll have to write around it, or we'll see. I haven't, my last 2 chapters of my book, the one I'm currently writing, got affected with the pandemic. And certainly that's just how it has to be. But I haven't gotten to those sections yet, so I haven't quite figured out the solutions there. I'm just sort of putting my head down, and I'm really glad that I got to travel as much as I did and meet as many people as I did in 2019. I'm very, 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 very lucky.
Can you give us a sneak peek into one of the foods that you think is endangered?
Oh, yes. And actually, I'm pulling from a list called the Ark of Taste, which is put together by Slow Foods International. And as they phrase it, it's a list of delicious and distinctive foods that are on the verge of extinction. And so their sort of motto for most of them are eat it to save it. If we create awareness about a different food product, then and if people buy it, then more farmers that can produce it, and then it gets saved. But they also list foraged foods too, and so the motto there is save it to eat it. So it also teaches responsible foraging and harvesting of wild foods as well. So the chapter I'm working on right now, I went to the Navajo Nation in June of 2019, and I went to learn about the Navajo churro sheep, which became a part of Navajo culture about 400 years ago, and so irrevocably altered the way that Navajos lived their lives that it basically the sheep got written into their creation story. So it changed society, Navajo society, so much that it changed their whole sense of identity. And a lot of contemporary Navajo association and identity is around this idea of sheep. I mean, you've probably seen beautifully woven Navajo blankets, whether you have one at home or seen one in a museum. Those are made with the wool from this sheep. And the meat of this sheep is like the taste of mutton, as they say, is part of being Navajo. Every Navajo knows what that tastes like. Having the sheep meant that you were always clothed and you were never hungry. So it's referred to as like your wealth. Your wealth is a Navajo. But because the American government instituted they basically called it like livestock, not relocation. They felt that the reservation was being overgrazed and that the Navajo had to reduce their flock. So once in the 1860s and then again in the 1930s, the American government came in and slaughtered over 60% of these sheep and pushed the Navajo to do other things, to either breed different animals or to basically become government dependent and accept food from the government as opposed to being able to practice their own food ways. So that by the 1970s, there were maybe 400 of these animals left when there had been 1 million. So there is now a huge effort to revive this animal because their wool is the highest quality wool there is for weaving and is very highly prized now. And their meat is considered to be the tastiest of lamb or mutton because most sheep have their fat all over their body. Mature sheep tend to have fat just around their organs, and it's in the fat that sheep have that particular like musky, sheepy smell, like smell and taste in the meat. So churro meat, which is also always pasture raised, tends to be very, very sweet and flavorful without being sort of gamey or musty. So yeah, I went to a festival out there called Sheep is Life, celebrating the sheep, and then I spent a couple days with a woman who herds the sheep and raises them for a living, as well as and sells the lambs for meat, as well as weaves incredible Navajo rugs. And I also ended up going to a four-star restaurant in Winslow, Arizona, that buys all of the lambs from this one particular shepherd that I visited too. So that's a chapter that I'm reading in right now. So right now I'm doing a lot of, I did the sort of in-person research last year, but I'm sure there'll be follow-up interviews. But right now it's a lot of academic reading to get my historical facts straight so that I can incorporate it into one story.
Well, that sounds fun and very interesting. So during this time where we've all been at home so much, have you discovered some other spice that you, not in your book necessarily, or flavor that you've really focused on? I know a lot of people made sourdough starter and, you know, like my daughter did that and fed it twice a day. And, you know, you go to the store looking for flour and yeast and you'd think you'd found gold if it was on the shelves. And so
Yeah.
what kind of things were you
I mean, I have
cooking?
a lot to thank my 19th and for some of you 18th century skill sets for. Like, I still have a coterie of people that were at that museum with me that are still close friends, and we all just sort of like gave a nod to all the skills we were using. Yeah, for me, I didn't go into sourdough. People tried to give me sourdoughs, and I was like, I don't want that responsibility.
Yeah, it is a big responsibility.
Responsibility. It's like having a pet that I can't like scratch under the chin. Um,
Exactly.
but when I was running out of yeast, I knew enough to take flour and water and add the yeast in and mix it together and create a live starter to stretch my yeast when I couldn't find any.
Mhm.
So having those skills, I think, was really important. Just yeah, and of course, like a lot of other people, I planted a garden this year. I saved my vegetable scraps to make stock. You know, all these little ways that we I think that those of us who study history in particular have found ways to stave off food insecurity because there are people in this country who are experiencing food insecurity all the time. That is a lack of access to food. And I think for a lot of us, this is the first time that we had a real experience with that, both early in the pandemic when supply lines were disrupted and we couldn't access food. But then just about a month ago here, during the protests that were here in Cleveland too, for the murder of George Floyd, they shut down the major business district in my neighborhood, which included the grocery store, the public market, and even the dollar store. So my entire community was left without food because of this imposed sort of lockdown in our neighborhood. So, those times are scary. So I find myself really relying on skills I've learned to stretch food, to preserve it, to make sure that there's something there for when things go wrong.
Yeah.
Oh, and I see the book recommendation, Allison. Thank you. I'm going to look into it. As a matter of fact, I'll write it down right now.
Do you have other favorite books that you like that are on flavors, spices, cooking? There was a book that we were looking at several books. There was one called The Food Explorer. I don't know if you're familiar
Yes,
with
I
that.
actually I write it so that the Food Explorer is about David Fairchild,
Right, right.
and Fairchild was a really interesting guy. He was sort of the USDA's first food scientist whose job it was to go around the world and collect plants. And he wanted to bring back varieties of plants that were superior varieties to what we had in America or start new industries. So, actually, the first chapter in my new book is all about Coachella Valley dates. And many people don't know that there is a date palm industry in the Coachella Valley of California. I think most people know Coachella for the music festival now. But it used to be referred to as America's Middle East because the climatic conditions were ideal for growing dates. And dates are still grown in the valley, and they were brought there and started there by David Fairchild. So that is a super fascinating story. One of my favorite food books is actually kind of food adjacent. It's called Gulp by Mary Roach, and it's about the alimentary canal, which is basically our mouth to our butt. And she goes through every part of our experience of taste to digestion to secretion. And I just found it so fascinating to understand, how food works with our bodies in many different ways. So I loved Gulp, honestly. It was a great mix of like foodiness and science.
What's her name? Mary Roach? Is that
Mary Roach. I'll write it in the chat as well. Mary Roach, and the book is Gulp. She's written a whole series of books, but I think Gulp, oops, I misspelled it. Gulp might be my favorite. She also wrote one, which was, I would say, the first narrative nonfiction book I ever read, excuse me, was called Stiff, and it was also by Mary Roach. And it was basically, it went through what happens to our bodies after we die in terms of like cremation or getting turned into a tree or looking a lot at the burial industry or donating your body to science. And I was 22 when I read it, and I just was so fascinated by it. And I also really enjoy Sarah Vowell as an author. She's a history writer. And Sarah Vowell's, my favorite book of hers, although it's not her most recent, is called Assassination Vacation. And it's the stories of the 4 presidents in American history that were assassinated. And it's just much like me, she travels and she goes to places and she interviews. And so I find her work very inspiring because it's a very lively telling of history and very sort of attached to the contemporary because she's going out and experience it and learning about it from experts as well as reading and spending time in archives too. I really like that blend because I just think it makes the writing more lively. It teaches you the history without it being very, very dry.
Yeah, well, certainly we found that in your book. It certainly did bring a lot of things to life. I'm curious to know if the group as a whole, after reading or hearing all of this, feels that these truly are all American flavors, or if they disagree with any of them or think you should have done. I know you said you didn't want to do coffee or chocolate or
Yeah, which definitely
cinnamon.
could be counted. And in a way, I mean, I also view this book as an opinion. I looked at data and, I described how I did that. But I also think that what we eat has a lot to do with heritage and regionality. And as I mentioned in the introduction, I wanted to look at a way to sort of unite America. How do we define American cuisine? But one of the things that's awesome about it is the diversity. So, actually, what I would love to know is what do you think the ninth flavor would be? What do you think is sort of the next up and coming thing that you see all over the place that will be my ninth chapter in the second edition of this book someday?
Hmm.
Do you have an idea, Kim?
You know, I kind of was leaning towards something like ginger. I like ginger root, not ground necessarily. I like that a lot, but I don't know if it's as widespread, but I like Thai food a lot, and you know,
Yeah, I think it's getting there. We talked about this a little bit earlier, but because ginger is such a huge part of cuisines from Southeast Asia, everywhere from India to China, and Thailand and Korea and beyond, that since that has been a major point of influx and immigration to America since the 1960s, I do think that ginger is becoming a bigger part of American food. And also, like, we love kind of a health fad too, and ginger is considered very healthy. I actually take ginger for a couple of reasons. Ginger is really great at settling your stomach, and it has also been proven effective against migraines. And I'm a chronic migraine sufferer, so sometimes I take it for prevention. Sometimes I take it when I get a headache, and it helps reduce the pain. But I love ginger. I love strong ginger, and I actually consume it quite a bit.
hmm hmm
Oh, pickling spices. That's cool. I like thinking of the idea of a spice blend. And I'd be curious what do you have a proprietary pickling spice blend? I feel like everyone's is a little bit different.
No. And so for our fifth grade field trip, the woman who came who did hearth cooking for us made something called Portugal Cakes. I don't know if you're familiar with
I'm
them,
not. Uh-uh.
but they were, she wouldn't really give us the actual recipe. You know, it's just a scoop of this, a scoop of that, or whatever. But it had rose water.
Mm-hmm.
They were more like soft cookies that were cooked on the on on the hearth, obviously. And the kids loved them, but the currants were from Portugal, and they were the prized currants, and so that's why they weren't the recipe wasn't from Portugal, but the currants were whether they all came from Portugal or not. They called them Portugal cakes because it was a higher status.
Oh, because that's where it was fancy for currants to come from. Yeah.
Yes.
There's a couple of things someday I've considered. I don't know if it's as interesting a project, but like in my mind, I've thought about writing about flavors that have disappeared. Like we definitely don't cook with currants as much as we once did.
Mm-hmm.
There's a spice called mace.
Mm-hmm.
Mace is actually part of the nutmeg fruit, which, yeah, from your 18th century recipes, you're probably familiar with it.
Right.
But you don't see it within mainland American cooking anymore. People in the Caribbean use it. You can find it in India. You can usually find it in Indian spice stores. But it used to be super common. And I think, yeah, and current's still used in England, but not as much here. I think that we don't use mace as much here because nutmeg's got a lot less expensive. So the nutmeg is the pit of a fruit, and mace is this sort of red, feathery material on the outside of the pit, and then there's an actual like fruit around it that kind of looks like a firm peach, I might say. And it's like yellowish reddish, but not fuzzy when it ripens. And so I think people were using that a lot as an alternative to nutmeg, which was very expensive until about the 1840s. And then after the 1840s, that's when we start to see people using mace a lot less and nutmeg a lot more. So I think that was the
Yeah.
part of it. Sometimes we don't like to have, oftentimes humans don't like to have two spices that have a similar taste. We sort of edit one and keep another. And you probably noticed from the 18th century too that brandy was used in cooking a lot more too. That was one I almost considered writing about in the book because the reason it disappeared was because of phylloxera, which was the huge grape blight that took place in Europe. And phylloxera started in the 1860s but got really bad in the second half of the 19th century. So wine and brandy pretty much disappeared, other than, especially as an ingredient. You were
Hmm.
only really buying it if you were wealthy, and if you were drinking it. You weren't mixing it into your cake or soaking your raisins, your currants in it. It was too expensive to use in that way. So we see recipes that use brandy sort of ending in the 19th century and not coming back again until like the 1950s and the revival of French cuisine with Julia Child and like that. So I'm also sort of fascinated with ingredients disappeared. Yes, Catherine just pointed out we use a lot of turmeric now, and two reasons: change in immigration population. You see, you keep coming back to that as more and more immigrants have come from India and Indonesia since the 1960s. But also, again, we love a health trend. We love a kale of flavor, right? So, like, turmeric has been shown to reduce inflammation. And also, I mentioned in the book, it's been studied really heavily in its that it can hopefully a chemical within turmeric can prevent Alzheimer's. And of course, the complication is we have the blood brain barrier. So if you ingest turmeric, it's not actually getting into your brain. But there is a chemical there that, if we can sort of deliver it to the brain, it clears away the plaque that is the telltale sign of Alzheimer's. So yeah, there's health benefits there, and I like the flavor of it. Very floral and beautiful. It's actually related. Turmeric is related to ginger. They're in the same family of rhizomes. Sausage mix. I don't know what sausage mix is. Tell me more. It's just the spices that go into a sausage.
I don't know, Ginny, what's sausage mix? I don't know. Well, fennel. What about fennel? That's a good spice.
Fennel's a good one. I feel like America has been historically adverse to licorice flavors because
Mm.
there's so many out there. There is, yeah, fennel and sage are great examples of it. And there's anise, anisette, star anise, which is actually a spice that grows on a tree, whereas anise is in like the caraway, carrot, coriander family. Um, but I'm open to it. I don't know if it's ever going to take. I don't know why it has, because those flavors are really associated with Eastern Europe and the Mediterranean. You have all of those like licorice based, like ouzo. All of those sort of like beverages that have those anise and anisette flavors to it. So I feel like licorice flavors, fennel flavors, that their time should be here already, and it hasn't really happened. So we'll see. If someone discovers a health benefit, it'll blow up.
No, I'm a big fan of black jelly beans, so I would go for it.
Same here, and I've tried and tried and tried to like it. Sometimes I like it in a blend, but it's just not one of my. I'm very American in that I'll go for the vanilla and the cinnamon every time, and like not go for the licorice. So it's interesting that it hasn't caught on here in the same way it has in other places. Kelly was saying, I'd be interested in the story of ginger. It has a trifold origin: Middle East, Southeast Asia. We see it in old English recipes: ginger beer, ginger bread. Where did ginger come from, and from the English foods come from? So ginger was part of the spice trade. So in the same way that all of these sort of, even though ginger is, how do I say it, a root as opposed to a bark or something that's growing from a tree, it still came on the same route through Persia and Turkey and into Europe. So it was in that like panoply of European spices. And then of course we see it in a lot of early American recipes, because early on most Americans were coming from this English heritage. And so we had access to all that powdered ginger to be able to make those early curries as well. So it's from like probably China, but probably so long ago and has been consumed so long ago that like a lot of those spices, like black pepper, it's hard to like pin it down. It probably came about in China, but then really quickly spread all over mainland and the islands of Asia too. Like I said, it's a rhizome, so we're eating essentially like a fleshy stem. Turmeric is in the same family. Galangal, which has a bitter taste, is often used in bitters, is in the same family. So
What
we
about horseradish? I mean, isn't that the same family?
horseradish, same family. Horseradish, I believe, is same family but native to Europe, to Central Europe too. Um, Super spicy, obviously. Oh yeah, saffron. Definitely something that I thought about talking about, but is too expensive to become widely popular. And when you do see it in medieval English cookbooks, it was largely used as color, both in medieval Europe and medieval Iran or Persia. They really loved to have brightly colored foods, and foods that sparkled, and foods that looked like one thing but are actually made of another thing. I mean, when I say they, I mean the really rich people. Everybody down at the bottom was just eating whatever they could. And there was actually a little bit of a culinary divide between, I mentioned this in the garlic chapter, if you were rich, you ate spices, and if you were poor, you ate herbs. And there had to be a cultural shift in the 19th century to get everyday people to eat herbs, because it was seen as something that like poor people do, and so people didn't want to eat it. So that's been a huge shift too. Well, I think we're coming about to the end of our time. But I want to put into the chat too information where you can get a hold of me. So my email is sarah@sarahlohman.com. Very simple. It's my name. That's also my website. And if you go to my website, you can, wait, I'm misspelling things. You can also sign up for my newsletter. And I do a lot of online classes and things right now, because it's nice to have an income, but also it's really nice to be able to connect with people in this way, especially when we are still so isolated too. So if you sign up for my newsletter, my events are always very, very affordable and sometimes free too. And if you're on Facebook or Instagram, you can find me at 4 Pounds Flour on both Facebook and Instagram. And that's where you can follow along with whatever I'm doing, cooking, or the research that I'm doing too. So it's just nice to meet you all, and I'm just so appreciative that you took the time to read my book. It's such an exciting thing to have other people read your words and then get to engage in a conversation with them. So maybe next time we'll get to see you in person.
Yeah, well, we feel very lucky to have had you, and thank you so much for giving us such a wonderfully enlightening talk today. And I'm inspired to go out and try some new things. And I'm definitely going to go to Penzi soon. It's just not on my normal route, but it's very close to us here. And I always leave there with something good or fun. Do you have a favorite spice blend of the moment from there?
Oh, that's a good
Like
question.
for grilling or something?
Yeah, their Arizona spice blend. I don't know
Oh,
what's in it, but a friend of mine gave me a bottle. Oh, my mom, she got it for free, and I just put it on everything. I actually love it on roasted vegetables, but it's really good like on hamburgers too.
ah,
But I
that's
also love that they have like a little sort of like in front of in their showroom in front of all their spices they have a little jar of the spices that you can smell or even like taste a little bit. So I've definitely bought things that I've never heard of there because I just thought it was interesting and got to experience it. But their vanilla is totally awesome too. I highly
oh,
recommend their
all
vanilla
right.
extracts.
Well, those are good tips, and we look forward to seeing you online and on your blog and Instagram and whatnot. And thank you. Thanks
Thank
everyone
you.
for joining us too.
A sincere pleasure, and I'll hopefully see you again sometime soon.
Good. Well, stay in touch. Good luck with your book, your new
Thank
one.
you.